Welcome to our second session with Lizzie Meister as we explore the Museum of Southern Jewish Experience. It's great to have you all back, and I'm going to keep my talk short today and just go ahead and hand it right off to Lizzie to continue her tour. So welcome, Lizzie. Thank you for joining us again this week.
Yeah. Thank you so much for having me again and for me to have the opportunity to share part two of our stories from the Museum of the Southern Jewish Experience. I'll share my screen in just a moment. Um, but I want to let everybody know that this is part two, but you didn't need to join us for part one. So if you're logged on, you're like, wait, part two, that's totally fine. This program, like last week's program, focuses on stories and artifacts from the museum gallery, focused on themes and not necessarily chronologically. So with that being said, let me go ahead and share my screen with all y'all and do a little bit of housekeeping. Um, so if you remember from last week, or again, you're just logging on for the first time, what this tour consists of, or this program consists of, is both a PowerPoint and a experience in our museum galleries. I'm in our galleries right now, and in a moment, I'm going to flip the camera around. So if you've logged in on a bigger tablet or a computer, you'll be able to adjust the size of your screen. So if you want to see what I'm looking at in the galleries, you would make my video window bigger. But if you are somebody who wants to, essentially lean over a object in our galleries, get that up close visual, you're going to want to look at the PowerPoint. If what I'm saying, you're like, I only see one image, that's totally fine. You'll get the full experience. So to do that, you'll notice this to like a slider right there, and you can move that back and forth. Okay, that's my housekeeping about image. And then also, if I encourage folks to ask questions, please pop those into the Q&A part of your webinar. And at the end, we'll have time for questions. So with that, just like last week, and always, let's talk a little bit about Southern Jewish trivia that you already know, and then hopefully I'll supply some more Southern Jewish trivia for you to learn today on our trip. So this one, actually, I will admit, if you were on with us last week, this one was answered. So take a moment, just like Jeopardy at home, you can yell at your screen the answer, but which southern city was known as the Ellis Island of the South? Was it A, Galveston, Texas, B, Charleston, South Carolina, or C, Miami, Florida? Take a moment to think about it. A, Galveston, B, Charleston, C, Miami. Hopefully you've all yelled your answer out. If you answered A, Galveston, Texas, you are absolutely correct. Around the turn of the 20th century, many immigrants came in through Ellis Island, but not all. About 10,000 Eastern European Jews came in through Galveston, Texas. And like I discussed last week, one of those immigrants, his name was Rachmel Shapiro, and we have his trunk here at the museum in New Orleans, Louisiana. And our second question, and I think this is really timely for this part of the year, which street treat traces its kosher roots back to Savannah, Georgia? Is it A, moon pies, B, pralines, or C, Girl Scout cookies? Take a moment. Again, maybe I gave it away with that time of the year, but if you said C, Girl Scout cookies, you were absolutely correct. So if you see those Girl Scouts standing outside your grocery store or have a family or friend selling Girl Scout cookies, perhaps buy them and honor their kosher southern Jewish roots. So on March 12th, 1912, the first meeting of what would become the Girl Scouts of the U.S. convened at the home of Juliet Gordon Low in Savannah, Georgia. Low was not Jewish, but is widely considered the founder of American Girl Scouting. But three of the other four women she tapped to lead the first Girl Scout troops were Jewish. And those were Lenora Amron, Mildred Guggenheimer, and Henrietta Falk. But the Jewish relationship to early Girl Scouting goes even deeper. than these three women. Most notably, the first commercially produced Girl Scout cookies were manufactured at Kosher Godly's Bakery in Savannah in 1936. A sweet little treat to consider on this Tuesday morning, afternoon, whatever time of day you're joining us. Okay, so we got a little bit of Southern Jewish trivia in our brain. Perhaps you know those answers, perhaps you didn't, but let me see if I can give you some other Southern Jewish pieces to discover. Last week, I shared that this is our museum, and it came to be open. We opened in 2021 in New Orleans, and an earlier iteration was located in Utica, Mississippi. But our collection started even earlier. So when small town Jewish communities started to realize they had a lot of stuff and no one was able to take care of it, they came to Jacob's camp director at the time. His name was Macy Hart. And he would also become the founder of the Institute of Southern Jewish Life, which housed the museum for a time. And they would say, our members, they're moving to bigger cities, or, as we all do, unfortunately dying, and we need a place for their stuff to go. So things like Torahs, congregational pews, a few organs came to Utica. So he began to receive more personal items like family photos, wedding dresses, merchant store records, scrapbooks, and even a wooden prosthetic leg. So as the collection grew, it took on a life of its own. While individually the artifacts may have seemed disconnected, together they started to draw a picture of Jewish experience, both religious and cultural, across Louisiana, Mississippi, and now the 13-state region that we encompass from Texas, Virginia, and down to Florida. So this collection tells a much bigger story of the community of diversity and acceptance. So, that's just another primer of what you're going to see today. So just like last week, we're going to go on themes, and we're going to start all the way back in 1762, which brings us to our first timeline. So I'm going to go ahead and flip my camera around, and you're going to start seeing the inside of our galleries, and we're going to go to 1762, back on our history journey. So, we're in New Orleans, right? So we're going to tell you that 13-state region, but we're going to focus critically on the stories of Jewish New Orleanians. And it's going to help us outline how Jewish identity was constructed in Europe. New Orleans was, French again, and then American. So we have this really interesting story here in New Orleans about how Jewish people interacted with those many European stories. So that colonial American story tells us about Côte Noire. What happened in 1962? France transfers New Orleans to Spain. And the Spanish reinforced Code Noir. And this was originally a decree passed by King Louis XIV in 1685 that defined the conditions of slavery in the French colonial empire. For the most part, this code concentrated on defining the conditions of slavery, passing conditions through the mother and not the father, and establishing harsh controls over those who were enslaved. The very first article, however, of Code Noir expels the Jews. So it reinforces and underscores the idea in New Orleans that the banishment of all Jews from the land is the law of the land in this new Spanish territory. People like Isaac Monsanto, who was New Orleans' first Jewish settler, was exiled and then fled to Florida, where under the 1763 Treaty of Paris, practicing Jews were allowed to settle for the first time in 215 years. With the growing need for colonists and capital, however, restrictions in New Orleans soon relaxed. So while that rule of Code Noir actually did not go away until, I believe, the Louisiana Purchase, you do see Jewish people in New Orleans before it becomes the United States. So as we understand the stories of Southern Jewish experience, we also need to be mindful of the conditions of Jewish people in Europe, and how that impacted early settlers and how that impacted the law, while also keeping in mind that sometimes the laws of our land don't necessarily come through in practice, because within 20 years of 1762, we do have Jewish people in Louisiana, in New Orleans, despite Code Noir. But let's hop on over to a time not so long after 1762 when the United States becomes the United States. We're Jewish people, and why Jewish people might have come to both the southern United States, but also the United States in general. So Jewish people immigrated due to religious tolerance, in part. This idea that Jewish people would be religiously tolerated was remarkable and not guaranteed. Following the revolution, early Jewish folks wondered. They wrote if they asked if they would be counted under this concept of religious freedom that was in the Constitution, in that First Amendment. What does religious freedom mean? Were these Jewish colonial and early citizens asking? So multiple Jewish communities, including Savannah, Georgia's Mikveh Israel, sent letters to President Washington, and which prompted a series of correspondence between Washington and the American Jewish community. These letters included invitations to speak at their congregations and highlight how Jewish residents would be treated in this newly formed country. The letter wished that, quote, the children of the stock of Abraham who dwell in the land continue to merit and enjoy the goodwill of other inhabitants. While everyone shall sit in safety under his own vine and fig tree, there shall be none to make him afraid, unquote, from George Washington. This idea that Jewish folks could count automatically as citizens, were not second-class citizens because of their religious beliefs, could own property, could vote, and to be able to worship freely, that was an incredibly new idea. This early promise of religious freedom, meaning not freedom to practice a specific type of religion, but instead freedom to practice any religion, has led to the aspiration of the Jewish American community. We hope for that safety and prosperity in the land, and as we know, sometimes that promise is met, and sometimes that promise is not met. But that hope is what we really think of to bring together why those early Jewish immigrants came to the United States. So now we're skipping in time a bit to how those Jewish folks made a life here in the American South. Last week, I talked a little bit about Jewish peddling, and how Jewish peddlers would go town to town selling their wares. And they were able to do that because they were able to participate freely in trade. And that then leads us to this 19th and early 20th century story of the Jewish merchant store. These stores were critical for small southern towns, as they frequently were the only place where one could get hardware to build one's house, to get farm equipment to make one's living, to get the flour, meal, and sugar to fill one's belly. These businesses left behind legacies, but also objects. These aren't necessarily the flashiest objects, but rather they tell us the history of commerce. So take, for instance, this ledger from Cohn Brothers in Jackson, Mississippi. And I'll get close to it in the gallery as well. This is a ledger, though more than 130 years old, and it connects us to the stories of Jewish people that may seem remarkably similar to our lives today. So perhaps if we have any merchants or sellers out there, you've used QuickBooks. Well, this is your grandfather's slow books. Little joke there. And in this ledger, we can see what folks were buying in Jackson. I guess it's Rodney, Mississippi, the Cohn Brothers store. Things like nails, a sack of flour, really give us a window into what people were doing and experiencing in the past. So it's our Coen Brothers ledger. I'm going to now pull us back because just like we talked last week about the Civil War, we talked a lot about how the Museum of the Southern Jewish Experience is one of the few places in the country that is going to be talking wholeheartedly about the experiences of Jews during the Civil War in the South, particularly as we talk about slavery, but also as we talk about soldiers and the lives of the folks who dedicated their lives to the Confederacy and Jews in the Confederacy. So this one's a fun one because we're in a corner of our museum. So we talk about how, there are merchant stores both during and after the Civil War. But Jewish involvement in their wider community was especially notable during this time period. So the Civil War, you probably all know, is America's deadliest war. Altogether, over 600,000 died in the conflict, more than World War I and World War II combined. We hear these numbers and we can think of a mass statistic. Yet, when we take into account the voices of the past, these 600,000 people become fathers, siblings, friends, aunts, and so much more. We aim to allow voices from the past to be able to speak for themselves. All of the text and label at the museum, of all the text and the labels at the museum, the largest, the most prominent are quotes. As we think about the Civil War, we can humanize not only the 600,000 dead, but also the many families and loved ones impacted by the war. Like Confederate soldier Samuel Yates Levy, who in a letter to his father, while taken prisoner of war at Johnson's Island in Ohio, said, "I long to breathe the free air of Dixie." We hear the justifications and hopes of war in these people's words, which is so critical to us today as we're still working to understand every person's perspective on the Civil War. At MSJE, we're talking critically and openly about Jewish involvement in slavery, right? We come up with a question of why. And it's only through these accounts that we can hope to understand the why. We understand the why of the terrible institution of slavery and how it was not just the wealthy, not just the powerful that justified slavery. It was not just one group of people. It was a society's justification of slavery. So what I hope you can see, because it's hard to, let me see if I can get him. It's in a very cool box here at the museum, but you can see a close-up version of this Civil War diary of Simon Mayer. This diary is from 1863, and it finishes in 1865 and records the events from 1863 to the surrender of the Confederacy from Simon Mayer's perspective. Mayer was a Confederate soldier and not a colonel, not a not high up, just a soldier in the army. And he writes about his opinions of the landscape, his opinions on slavery, his view of the war itself. He wrote, quote, "I hope that I may be spared the witnessing again of such sights as were there to be seen. Men who but a few short moments before were all in the vigor of life, now lie prostrate on the desolating hand of war, bruised and mangled in every conceivable manner." But to say that Mayer wholeheartedly disliked the war would be a misrepresentation. Throughout the diary, he celebrates the wins of the Confederacy, and he laments the North. So through the words of this young soldier, we get a complicated perspective from his diary, and it helps us piece together our Southern Jewish story. The written word is a critical aspect of our understanding of the past. And we know, folks, this is gonna be a little turnaround, like we know that Jewish folks in the past held deeply racist beliefs and challenged prominent Jewish people with more progressive views, such as Rabbi Max Lilienthal, whose image is the main image you're seeing in front of you. We have this interesting layered image of Rabbi Lilienthal that speaks to the vitriol that some Southerners felt to um, the rabbi, who was an important leader in Cincinnati, and he was an abolitionist. Uh, and so, what you're seeing in this image is a letter written over an image of Rabbi Lilienthal from Jacob A. Cohen, who was a North Carolinian, and he was writing a letter of protest to Rabbi Lilienthal in 1861. And he inscribes the following statement over this lithograph. Cohen wrote, "Sir, since you have discarded the Lord and taken up the sword in the defense of a Negro government, your picture, which has occupied a place in our Southern homes, we herein return that you may present them to your beloved Black friends, as they will not be permitted in our dwelling. Your veneration for the Star-Spangled Banner is, I presumed, in your pocket." Cohn, just like other Southerners at this time, felt a frustration of Lilienthal's beliefs enough to write over an image of the rabbi and defended him, somebody that he venerated before. Um, so Jacob Cohn was killed at the Battle of Second Bull Run in 1862. However, his perspective certainly wasn't just his own. There were other Jews in the South who felt the same vitriol. But we know that perspectives are complicated, and while they were shared by Jacob Cohn and other people in 1862, those beliefs and practices could change. So we can't ascribe one view to all Southerners or all Jews. And what's interesting is we can quite literally see this play out in our collection. So just 10 years later, we know that Rabbi Lilienthal was back in the South. And he delivered a sermon at the dedication of Natchez, Mississippi synagogue. Natchez, Mississippi was the second biggest slave trading city. Oh, no, it was the largest slave trading city in Mississippi. It was the second largest trade city in the whole US, second to New Orleans. But Rabbi Lilienthal in 1872 was at the dedication of the temple. He was a person of honor. And you can see, let me see if I can find exactly where it says Rabbi Lilienthal. So benediction by Rev. Dr. Lilienthal. Hopefully everybody can see that in that 1872 program. So even with his progressive views, he was a person of honor at this new synagogue in Natchez City, the largest slave trading city in Mississippi. And it shows starkly how important it is to not ascribe a single narrative to perspectives in history. So just as new synagogues like Natchez opened following the Civil War, there were other new unions as well. So we talked not only about the union of community, such as large as a synagogue, but also, oh, there's that. But the union of two people is also a very important Jewish union for us to be thinking about too. So this wedding dress was worn by Bertha Hirsch. And I want to underscore that there are many ways we consider this dress, and that creates a tie that binds the wider Southern Jewish community together. A proof that even when a community is small, Jewish people look to create matches across different distance. I want to turn to, however, the object itself. We didn't know much about this object before it was put on display. We had only the name of the object owner, Suzanne R. Rosenzweig. But with some research, we were able to uncover that Miss Hirsch wore this dress to marry Nathan Simon of Gainesville, Texas. We learned that these two married in New Orleans. They were married by Rabbi James Kopel Guttheim of Temple Sinai, and that the ceremony was held at the St. Charles Hotel. An article from the Times-Picayune, our local newspaper here in New Orleans, reports that the couple was wed under a beautiful umbrella of roses, which to me sounds like a chuppah, but who knows? All this is enough to write an interesting museum label. But our visitors hold knowledge too. I was recently doing a program with some local folks, and one person happened to know a lot about fashion history. And as I always do, as an educator here at the museum, we talk about this object itself. We almost always observe that this dress is for a small person. And the shoes that were next to them are also quite small. I'd always hypothesized that people in the past were just smaller, something that perhaps some of you in the community today are like, yeah, I've heard that too. But this person who knew a lot about fashion history informed me that that's just not the case. Rather, these smaller clothes are what we tend to see in museums or antique stores, and they point to how objects are used and reused. So, say that Bertha Hirsch happened to be not this small woman, but instead a tall and stocky woman. Her dress would have certainly been larger. Well, then Bertha would have given her dress to a shorter niece who would have tailored it to fit her. That niece might have gifted it to her sister, who would have tailored it to fit her thinner waist. And down and down and down, the dress would be tailored by a seamstress. But what happens when there's no one else to take these small dresses? Well, that's when it ends up in an attic or, a closet or what have you. And eventually it can end up in a museum like ours. So it's not that the people in the past were smaller, but rather that the ways our fabric would get recycled and recycled until the last use is no longer a physical use, but a sentimental use. Um, so now we're moving on to a section in the museum where we're thinking about institution building, um, uh, just like those synagogues. So Jewish institutions served as sites of celebration, uh, sites for weddings, bar mitzvahs, baby namings, etc. But also as places to serve Jewish communities in times of need. I got to really back up for this one. Which brings us to most fortunate and fortunate. From the Civil War and yellow fever to economic depressions and natural disasters, thousands of Jewish and non-Jewish children found themselves without proper care in the mid-1800s and the early 1900s. While Jewish orphanages existed throughout the South, including Atlanta, the Jewish Orphans Home of New Orleans was one of the oldest and longest-run orphanages in the region. It operated from 1855 to 1946. Originally, it was organized as the Association for the Relief of Jewish Widows and Orphans. It became known as the Home, and it took in 1,623 children from 8 states in the South. So rather than isolate these orphans, the Home founded Isidore Newman School in 1903, so they could they would be taught alongside children from the wealthiest families in New Orleans. Many families can trace their stories back to Jewish orphans home across the South. And we are very excited to be opening a new exhibit in in just 3 weeks from tomorrow, called Most Fortunate and Fortunate, co-curated by author Marlene Tressman, who has a book of the same name. And so we invite folks to hopefully come down and visit that special exhibition, but also hop onto our website to see more information about programming for that exhibit. I also want to add one more thing about Isidore Newman School. So Isidore Newman School was and is still one of the most highly rated schools in New Orleans. And there are very famous alumni from there, including both Eli and Peyton Manning, as well as the other Manning. So this school started as an orphan school, or a school for the orphans, but has now become probably New Orleans' most prestigious prep school. If anybody's on from any of the other prestigious prep schools in New Orleans, I hope that's okay that I said. Okay. So now we're going to take another break out of our timeline to explore our Foundations of Judaism gallery. So this gallery serves as a place to learn about the values and objects of Judaism, while also highlighting stories that are from our region. Let me see if I can get this. Okay, that looks. So frequently folks come to the museum to not only learn about this region, but how we're connected to the city that we live in. And often people are visiting, right? They want to know more about New Orleans. So most of the objects in this gallery, as well as most of the images, are from Jewish communities of New Orleans. So these two shofar wrote, the one short, one long, come from Congregation of Gates of Prayer and Shir Hadash Conservative Congregation. So we use these objects to teach how, uh, this is a ritual ram's horn instrument, and folks can even listen to a shofar being played. And I forgot to share my sound, so trust me, the shofar plays, and people can listen to that. But museums can be many things, and they can be sanctuaries of quiet, they can be classrooms, they can be session spaces, and more. So at MSJE, our Foundation of Judaism atrium, voices carry. Frequently, those voices are the sounds of delight of young folks getting to share with their parents and grandparents something they learned, or a volunteer sharing their story with visitors. The impact of this gallery cannot be underappreciated. At MSJE, we welcome all, from Jewish folks to non-Jewish folks, from Southerners to international communities. And it serves as an opportunity for folks to get a deeper understanding of Judaism. We aim to be a place of learning, and our school groups that are coming in, they're learning about these ancient traditions of Jewish people and how those traditions are continued to this day in the space, and that's critical to our mission. These young folks consider their own moral and religious traditions while still seeing the tenets of Judaism reflected back to them. So this is my little plug. We do field trips, both in person and virtual, at the museum. So if you know a teacher or an educator who might be interested in working with us to present our story to young folks, please have them reach out to me, and my information will be on that last slide. So our little break from our timeline story is over, as we are now entering our new era. In our entering a new era, we're following World War I, and we're taking a look at the world anew. The South and Jews in it experienced this era amongst their fellow countrymen. Like before, we have a timeline of notable histories that help us understand the eras we are entering into and how space and place matter to them. This timeline highlights both continuities and changes from the past, progression from Jews being separated, discriminated against, into being accepted into their community. For instance, we're talking about prior 1949, when we're talking about discrimination. Let me see if I can, okay, there she is. Where in Miami Beach, it was legal for hotels and real estate to discriminate against Jewish people. We can see hotels advertising for things like Gentiles only. And they often did on postcards. We have a pretty large collection of postcards from this era, saying Gentiles only, or having language that nods to that concept near churches, only respectable clientele. However, in May of 1949, this law, the law in Florida was, there was a law in Florida that was written to outlaw discrimination against Jews in hotels and real estate. And that led to a serious expansion of Jewish vacationers. So in Miami Beach, the Jewish population grew from 15% in 1940 to 80% in 1970, which how it got its nickname, the shtetl by the sea. So we can see this changing story of discrimination throughout our timelines and our history. In this gallery, we focus quite specifically on two landmark histories, which I talked about last week. Just like I always say, we would not be a Jewish museum if we didn't talk about, and we would not be a Southern museum if we did not talk about civil rights from a Southern perspective. In our Holocaust gallery, we are telling the story of Holocaust survivors from a Southern perspective. Southern Jews served in the military. Southern Jews had families and loved ones in Eastern Europe. before, during, and after the Holocaust, Jews escaped as refugees and survivors and made their new home and life here in the American South. And we're focusing on stories of individuals. Right before we enter our gallery, our Holocaust gallery, we are met with this tefillin bag from Yosef Sher. This was the only possession that Yosef brought that survived the Holocaust, and it speaks to the importance of Sher's religious life both in Europe and in America. Yosef and his wife Rachel eventually settled in New Orleans, and they were part of a social club called the New Americans Club, a group of Holocaust survivors in cities across America and the South. As years moved on, many survivors courageously provided their stories to educate their communities about the Holocaust and millions' lives. So the image you're seeing is an image of the New Americans Club, the children of the New Americans Club. And that little boy right there, with the arrow, is Leopold Scher, who is Yosef Scher's son. And this New Americans Club really became each other's family. The New Americans in this club, rather, became each other's family. And even today, are a very important part of Holocaust education here in New Orleans. Now let's go ahead and enter this gallery, and I'm going to take you to what I consider the most unassuming object in our whole museum. During the war, there were many young Americans who went to Europe to fight and to rescue. Perhaps the oddest thing on display in the museum are just a pair of socks. These socks belong to Gerald Posner, who fought in World War II in hand-to-hand combat to secure Maison Saint-Edouard, a children's sanatorium in Belgium. Posner and his company found women and children hiding in a basement and gave them dry socks. When Posner returned to Belgium for the 50th anniversary of the Battle of the Bulge, several of the students and their teachers returned the socks and their things. And I'm going to add one more thing that connects Gerald Posner to some other folks in our gallery, something that you'll only get when we're talking on a tour of our gallery. So hopefully you can see this image. It's a blown up mural. I don't have a picture of it on our slideshow, but hopefully you can see this blown up mural image. This image was taken by Paul Arzt, who was also a boy from Louisiana who a Jewish kid from Louisiana who joined up and was in Europe during World War II. He happened to also be Gerald Posner's LSU college roommate and good friend. And Gerald and Paul were not in the same company, but they did see themselves zigzagging through Europe. And whenever there was a large gathering of U.S. soldiers, Gerald and Paul would bump into each other. And in letters, they mentioned to both of their parents how nice it was to see their good friend, even though they weren't fighting alongside them. Paul took this image of Jewish concentration camp survivors post-liberation. So hopefully you can see the little boy in the forefront, though skinny, and the folks in the back are also, skinny and hungry, but most of them are smiling. Most of them seem relieved. This is just one of the many images that Paul sent back to his family. And in the letters that Paul wrote with the family with these negatives, he says, please do not, this is not a direct quote, but he says, please do not get these developed before I come home. Because the images you're going to see are heart-wrenching. And so this Jewish boy from Louisiana saw his co-religionists in need and took these images, but also acknowledged that they were really hard images to just send home. And without a conversation, we would never know that this image taken by Paul Arzt and these socks of Gerald Posner are connected in any way. But I like to share that with folks to let you know that there aren't that many degrees of separation. whether in the Jewish community or the Southern Jewish community. Okay, that's my only little aside. Now let's head into our civil rights gallery, this connected gallery, where we're exploring the stories of upstanders, those leaders in the Jewish and non-Jewish community who fought actively for civil rights, and the perpetrators, those folks in Jewish and non-Jewish communities who advocated for segregation. There is a third, and perhaps the largest category, those bystanders, who, for a variety of reasons, stayed silent on the sidelines of history. Rabbis in Southern communities faced a particular set of concerns on civil rights. I think I was asked a question about this last week, but this week I want to speak directly about Rabbi Perry Nussbaum, who is the rabbi of Beth Israel Congregation in Jackson, Mississippi, whose clerical collars we are seeing. And he was an active supporter of the Freedom Riders in the summer of 1951 and helped establish the Interfaith and Interracial Committee of Concern. The organization provided funds and support to rebuild churches bombed by white supremacists in 1967. Rabbi Nussbaum's own temple and house was burned, but Rabbi Nussbaum didn't feel like he had the support of the Jewish or non-Jewish community. Speaking on his experience in Jackson, Rabbi Nussbaum said, "But as the situation worsened, as attacks were mounted, and generally, everybody got scared, everybody ran, and there were threats against any minister who even dared to hint that segregation was, quote, unchristian and a sin, and so on and so forth. When this atmosphere spread, the rabbi definitely becomes a lone wolf. And the rabbi today is much more a lone wolf, because I'm the last of the clergymen who were in Jackson in 1954. Anything that I've done, I did on my own, and in the process, I've created a lot of enemies. I've been the gadfly, and there have been times when people were afraid even to be associated with me because they knew what I stood for. They knew what I was saying, and it was dangerous," unquote. So Nussbaum speaks so deeply of the isolation he felt, not only because of his beliefs, but because of his Jewish identity. So as a rabbi in Jackson, he really felt isolated. So we talk a lot about civil rights history, but we're also talking about activists here at the museum. So they're not the only stories we're telling. We're thinking about these activists, particularly Southern Jewish women activists. And we feature 13 different Jewish women who are activists in their own respects. Folks like Susie Post from Kentucky, who is a lifelong human rights activist. She served as the executive director for local ACLU chapter and founded the Metropolitan Housing Coalition to secure affordable housing. She also organized a march of nearly 6,000 to protest President Richard Nixon's bombing of Cambodia in 1973. So we are now moving into our last gallery, where we think about the future of Southern Jewish experience while still accounting for our past. We focus on the impact of Jewish summer camps as the formation of young Jews' identity, and we all have an opportunity to learn more. Oh, you know what? I skipped a paragraph. Let me rewind a little, y'all, because we have to go past this culture makers wall. We're talking about Jewish culture makers and the impact that Southern Jews have on our region. Folks like Alfred Urey, who is a playwright, dramatized the trial and lynching of Leo Frank. Perhaps some of you have seen this this play, this musical. This play, it's not a musical. Somebody will correct me, I'm sure. And he himself, Harry, is a Jew from Georgia. And we talk about this Leo Frank story. The other thing, before I move into our last gallery, that I didn't talk about last week is about this image that is on my other PowerPoint, but not on this one. So hopefully you can see the gallery again. Up in the corner, we have a case within a case. And this is a golden lacquered bagel. You might be saying, what is a golden lacquered bagel doing in two cases at the Museum of the Southern Jewish Experience? Well, we're not only talking about Jewish culture makers in this famous Jewish culture makers, but we're also talking about how Southern Jews have become part of the culture. So here in New Orleans, just 2 weeks ago, we had Mardi Gras. And it is a celebration. Carnival is a Catholic celebration where all across the world people celebrate. Here in New Orleans, it's very focused on parading groups. And while historically Jews were not able to parade during Carnival, there are now two Jewish crews, Crew de Jews, spelled J-I-E-U-X, whose bagel you're seeing. And they throw this signature throw out. You might have heard of people throwing beads. Well, people also create very intricate and beautiful throws that people across the city and the country keep as mementos. And Crew de Jews memento is this golden lacquered bagel. The reason it's in two cases here at the museum is because it is a real bagel, and we do not know how it is going to disintegrate over time. So we have decided to put it into two cases so as to not impact the other objects in this case. And now we're in our final gallery where we're thinking about Southern Jews today. We have this one very fun interactive, probably our most stopped at interactive and story here at the museum, and that's our Summer Camp Sweethearts Wall, where we're focusing on the stories of people who've met their loved one at Jewish summer camp. And what it means for the Southern Jewish community to have this connection, realizing now I also have an image of this one, which is funny. And we're still actively collecting for this one. So if you know anybody who met their loved one at Southern Jewish camp, we love a picture of them at camp and then them at their wedding or them today with their family. And truly the last thing I'm going to talk about is our state-by-state exhibition. Most objects at museums are not actually on display. We probably have about 5%, maybe 10% of the objects in our collection on display. But this state-by-state exhibition allows folks to dive deeper into our collection that might not be behind glass, but we do have. And we're constantly updating our state-by-state exhibit so people can explore stories and objects that we have behind the scenes. So if you're a donator, if you don't want to donate to the museum, like collection objects, that's where they would go first and foremost. And with that, that is the stories that I have from part 2 of our tour. I invite folks to ask questions, and I hope that I can answer them. I've included ways to engage. Please follow us on all the social medias to find out what's happening at the museum. We talk a lot about history, but we're also talking about what's happening in the Southern Jewish community today. For instance, next week we have a program with professional basketball player Dan Grunfeld that we invite everybody to come to. And if you'd like to support us by becoming a member, we appreciate that as well. So that now I'll open it up to the questions that came in.
Great. Thank you. Thanks again for sharing the museum with us. It's so many beautiful exhibits and so much history to share and learn about. One question to get us started, while those of you with questions feel free to write more in, is if you want to say more about your experience with non-Jewish communities that have, what is their reaction when they come to the museum, or are there areas in which they find most intriguing for them?
Absolutely. So yeah, we welcome everybody. I'd say we're working towards a 50-50 split of Jewish, non-Jewish visitors. And by and large, non-Jewish visitors are amazed by the depths of the Southern Jewish community. They've heard a little bit about the Jewish community, though they have the opportunity to learn more about Judaism in our Foundations of Judaism gallery. But learning about the specificity of Southern Jews allows folks to see our Jewish story beyond, the pockets that we might get in public school or we might hear on the news. Um, and so it really opens people up to the diversity of Jewish experiences. Um, I'm, in addition to being able to give these wonderful tours, I'm the educator here at the museum. And I would say a lot of the young people who come to us have a window into the Jewish identity because they learned about the Holocaust education. And to hear that Jewish community existed before and continues to exist post Holocaust is something that's really important for them to understand and to celebrate the diversity of the community they live in today.
Thank you. Another question here. The 1872 program for the Natchez Minister installation referred to the shul as a temple. Were this and other Jewish communities in the South mainly Reform? And were there Orthodox shuls?
Absolutely. Oh, okay. So this one in particular, that's the wedding dress. Come on. Okay. So this is the image that we're talking about. So the reform movement really took off here in the South. So Cincinnati had that first community. Lilienthal was part of the reform movement, I believe. And that value, the ability for Jewish people to practice Jewish values, but maybe not practice Jewish halacha or ritual law, was really great for Southern Jews in rural areas. And a way for them to maintain their Jewish identity. So the reform movement really took off in the American South. Don't quote me on this, but I think 7 of the 8 earliest Reform synagogues were in the South. And so Natchez was one of those Reform synagogues. There were Orthodox synagogues and continue to be Orthodox synagogues in the South. Some Orthodox synagogues were in rural areas like Greenwood, Mississippi. They still have the old, like very old, like Orthodox prayer books, and they still use that. It's a very small community. And cities like New Orleans and Savannah and these bigger cities, those had Orthodox communities as well. But by and large, the smaller, Greenwood is kind of an exception. The smaller Jewish communities were Reform, though there are Orthodox Jews and continue to be Orthodox Jews in the American South.
Just as a follow-up, just to be the most pluralistic, is there anything you want to say about the conservative communities and or Reconstructionist, if you know anything
Yeah.
about that
I mean,
group?
I know here in New Orleans in particular, we got everybody. We have free reform, a conservative, a modern Orthodox, Chabad, and then some not like building situated Reconstructionist communities or non or like pluralistic communities. But we got everybody, and I think that's true across the South. So wherever there are Jews, there are a variety of different ways. But then there are also towns like Jackson, Mississippi, a place I've also lived, that has one synagogue. It's a Reform synagogue. But that doesn't mean that everybody who goes to that synagogue is a Reformed Jew. Sometimes in these small Jewish communities, you go where it's available, and those communities end up, growing and shrinking. Their Jewish practice and their way they're doing things to reflect the needs of their community.
Another question. There's several people who have joined us who are from different museums in the South, and so I was wondering what your relationship is with some of the different museums, and if you're able to share, um, partner together or share your resources in different ways.
I mean, it absolutely. We are we have objects from across the gamut of Jewish or Jewish and non-Jewish organizations. So some of our most prized objects at the museum, like our which I talked about last week, the 1862 bill of sale from the Bremen Museum in Atlanta, Georgia. And we have a variety of other objects on display that are on loan, but we also work with different museum communities to bring on programs, and behind the scenes, just like every other professional organizations, there are professional Jewish museum organizations that we're a part of and professional museum organizations that we're a part of. to connect us with folks. If anybody's on the call who is from one of those museums and wants to connect on a specific project, my email's right here. But we do certainly work with our community around us.
Wonderful. There's a couple of comments that people have said. One, somebody noted that Parade is a musical.
It is a musical. Okay,
Is it?
thank you.
Yeah, I have. Yeah, actually saw it. I saw it myself also in New York. This person, I'm not sure if they did or not, but it's worthwhile to see if anybody gets the chance. Um, and some other people have noted some of their different cities, such as Nashville, that has a number of different congregations of different groups. So, as you would expect in most cities or most major cities around the country at this point have a variety of denominations. Uh,
Absolutely.
we've I think we've come to a nice point here. We're at about an hour for the session. I was wondering if there's anything, anything final you would like to say about. I know you've talked about wanting everybody to come see the museum. If there's anything further you would like to say to highlight the museum as we close the second session out.
Yeah, I appreciate everybody joining us and the Haberman Institute for having me. We invite everybody to come down to New Orleans. Right now is kind of peak great weather season, and we're heading into festival season. So, come to New Orleans, come to the museum, make it a special trip just to see the museum. And we invite you all. So I will just say 3 weeks we're opening our special exhibition. About the Jewish Orphans Home. It's got the same name as the book by Marlene Trestman, Most Fortunate Unfortunates, and that will be open for 8 months. So plan it in the next 3 weeks or plan it in the next 4, 5, 6, 8 months and come see us and then follow us for our programs. For instance, next week, Wednesday, we're hosting author and former professional basketball player Dan Grunfeld to talk about his family, who has a history of professional basketball, but also is a family of a Holocaust survivor. So it's very interesting talk. We invite folks to join us virtually. And then we have a bajillion other programs. So please follow us there. And thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing the museum, and I hope everyone has enjoyed exploring the different aspects and the journey through time. So, and we look forward to keeping this partnership alive. So, for those of you that are interested in Southern culture and stuff, feel free to send me or anybody here at Lizzie ideas, and hopefully we'll work together again soon. So, thank you all, and thank you all for joining us. Take care and have a great rest of your day.